On my birthday, my husband stood in front of everyone and told me I was useless. Then he laughed, slipping his hand onto another woman's waist while my friends pretended not to see. I didn't cry. I just watched. Weeks later, when the police took him away in handcuffs, he finally saw who was truly powerless. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. After the divorce, the silence in my apartment had started to feel like a fragile kind of freedom. I had spent 32 years tied to a man who could drain the air out of a room with nothing but his presence. 3 months after signing the papers, I thought I could finally breathe again. But the night Richard Carter returned, standing in my doorway with bloodshot eyes and a sneer curling his lips, I realized freedom was not something he was ready to let me have. If you dare date someone, he spat, his voice a raw growl, you'll really see who I am. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. His gray hair was damp with sweat, his shirt wrinkled as if he had pulled it from the floor. The smell of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. He had been drinking again, his weapon of choice long before fists or threats. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the edge of the door, ready to slam it shut, though my heart thudded in a frantic rhythm. I smiled instead, not because I wasn't afraid, but because after all these years I had learned that fear was the one thing he fed on. He expected me to cower. He expected me to beg. He expected me to be the woman I had been for so long, the one who kept quiet, who endured his rage in silence. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Richard's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to resistance. His hand twitched at his side, and for a brief second I thought he might try to force his way in. Then a voice floated from across the hallway. "Evening, Evelyn," called Helen Brooks, my neighbor, as she watered her potted violets outside her door. She gave me a small, knowing smile. Richard stiffened, his jaw tightening. He hated being seen, hated the thought of anyone catching a glimpse of the man behind his mask of charm. He leaned in close enough for me to feel the heat of his breath. "You think you're free now, don't you?" he whispered. "But you're not. You'll never be." Then he stepped back, his glare slicing through me, and stormed down the hallway. The echo of his boots against the worn carpet carried his anger even after he was gone. I closed the door and pressed my back against it, trying to steady my shaking hands. My apartment, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt invaded. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the building another warning. I told myself to breathe, but the air felt thin, as if he had stolen it with him. It wasn't the first time Richard had tried to break me. For years, he chipped away at my confidence, piece by piece, until I was nothing more than an echo of the woman I used to be. He was a master of disguise, the charming husband at dinner parties, the doting father in public. But behind closed doors, he was a storm, unpredictable, violent, and relentless. Tonight, though, something in his eyes had shifted. There had always been anger, but this time there was something colder, sharper, something dangerous. I walked slowly to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the reflection trembling in the window pane. 65 years old, divorced, and still living under the shadow of a man who believed he owned me. My gray hair was pulled back in a bun, my eyes tired but still carrying sparks of the girl I once was. The girl who had once loved recklessly, who had once believed in the possibility of forever. Jonathan Miller's name flickered across my mind, uninvited but unstoppable. He had been my first love, the man whose touch had once made me feel infinite. He had been everything Richard was not, gentle, steady, ambitious in ways that inspired rather than crushed. But I had chosen differently back then, letting fear of uncertainty guide me into a marriage that promised stability and delivered only chains. Richard never knew about Jonathan. He never knew that my heart had belonged to someone else before it belonged to him. And if he ever found out that the man I had once loved was his very own boss, the consequences would be unthinkable. I pressed my fingers against the cool glass and tried to push the thought away, but the memory of Jonathan's eyes, steady, kind, filled with a fire that had never dimmed, would not leave me. Maybe it was fate's cruel trick that after all these years, our paths were destined to cross again. Or maybe it was life's final gift to me, a reminder that even after decades of darkness, love could still find its way back. But that night, as I locked every door and checked every window, I didn't think about love. I thought about survival. Because Richard's words were not an idle threat. They were a promise. and deep down, I knew he meant every one of them. The night after Richard's outburst, sleep refused to come. Memories moved through me like restless ghosts, tugging me backwards to a time when my life had looked so different. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and let the past unfold. When I first met Richard Carter, I was 23 and full of restless dreams. He was tall, confident, and persuasive in a way that made the world bend toward him. My friends called him charming, and in those early days, I believed it. He spoke of a future with certainty, steady work, a home of our own, a family. After a childhood marked by instability, I mistook his forceful promises for security. I wanted to believe he could be my anchor. At first, he was attentive. He held doors open, remembered my favorite songs, and filled my evenings with plans. But even in those early months, shadows crept in. His questions about where I had been, who I had spoken to, seemed harmless at first. Signs of devotion, I told myself. Over time, though, they sharpened into suspicion. I learned how to edit my words, how to make my world smaller so his temper would not flare. What haunted me most was the memory of the choice I had made before Richard. His name was Jonathan Miller. He was a few years older, already carving his way into the business world with quiet determination. Where Richard was a storm, Jonathan was steady light. He listened in a way that made me feel seen, not managed. With him, I had laughed freely, dreamed recklessly. I had been 19, barefoot in the summer grass, believing that kind of love could carry me through a lifetime. But life does not always bend toward love. My parents disapproved, insisting Jonathan's ambitions would take him far away, leaving me behind. They urged me to settle down with someone stable, someone who could provide. Richard arrived at just the right moment, polished and persuasive, promising roots rather than wings. I wanted to be practical, to be safe. So I walked away from Jonathan, choosing marriage over risk, security over passion. The early years with Richard were not yet unbearable. We bought a modest house, filled it with secondhand furniture, and later with the laughter of our daughter, Emily. I convinced myself that happiness was something you could build with duty and routine. Richard was strict but protective, moody but hardworking. When his drinking began, I told myself it was stress, that all men had their vices. When his words turned cutting, I told myself it was a phase. But the phases stretched into decades. By the time Emily was in high school, I had learned to read the tension in the set of Richard's jaw, the slump of his shoulders, the way the bottle in his hand foretold the storm that was coming. I learned how to soothe his temper, how to disappear into silence when his voice grew sharp. There were nights when the shouting shook the walls, when Emily cried in her room while I whispered through the door that everything would be all right. Though I knew it was a lie, I became an expert at hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, hiding tears behind practiced smiles, hiding the truth from neighbors who saw only the mask Richard wore in public. He was charming at gatherings, quick with a joke, generous with handshakes. People said I was lucky to have a husband so dedicated, a man who provided. If only they knew what that provision had cost. The years hardened me. I grew quieter, smaller, but deep inside I carried a wound that never closed. The memory of Jonathan, the life I might have had if I had chosen differently. Sometimes I imagined what it would feel like to see him again, though I never dared believe it could happen. He was part of another world, one that had closed to me the day I said I do to Richard. And yet fate has a cruel way of circling back. Sitting at my kitchen table that sleepless night, I pressed my palm against the cool wood and let the weight of the years settle over me. I was 65, divorced, and still haunted by the choices I had made in my 20s. The cracks in my marriage had not appeared overnight. They had always been there, hairline fractures that deepened with time until the foundation collapsed. Richard believed he still held power over me, that his threats could chain me even now. But the truth was, something inside me had shifted. The silence of my apartment was teaching me that life, however fragile, still held possibilities. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I could almost feel the presence of that younger version of myself, the barefoot girl who had once believed in love. And I wondered if she might not be entirely gone after all. It began with the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallway, heavy and uneven, a rhythm I knew too well. My chest tightened before I even opened the door. Richard Carter was back. The doorbell rang once, sharp and demanding. I froze, holding my breath, hoping maybe he would leave. But Richard didn't leave. He never left when he wanted something. The second ring was longer, followed by his fist slamming against the doorframe. "Evelyn!" he barked, his voice booming through the thin wood. "Open this damn door!" I opened it just a crack, my heart pounding in my throat. Richard's face loomed in the gap, flushed from drink, his lips curled in contempt. He shoved against his door, forcing me to step back. I gripped the handle, steadying myself as he pushed his way inside. "You think you can ignore me? Pretend I don't exist?" His words were sharp, spit flying with every syllable. "I made you. Without me, you're nothing." His rage filled the apartment, suffocating the fragile peace I had tried to build. I glanced at the window, at the world outside that kept on turning while mine stood still. And then, from across the hall, a door opened. Helen Brooks, my neighbor, stood there holding a small watering can, her gentle face framed by a silver hair. She looked from Richard to me, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Everything all right, Evelyn?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with quiet suspicion. Richard stiffened, his jaw clenching. He despised witnesses, despised anyone who might pierce the polished image he worked so hard to maintain. He turned slightly, his back blocking Helen's view of me. "Mind your own business," he snapped. Helen didn't flinch. She simply lifted her chin and said, "If I hear shouting again, I'll call the police." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, steady and questioning, before she disappeared back inside her apartment. The silence that followed was more dangerous than the shouting. Richard turned back to me, his voice dropping into a hiss. "Don't you dare make me look like a fool in front of her. Don't you dare." He stepped closer, close enough for me to smell the bitterness of whiskey on his breath. His hands twitched at his sides, restrained only by the knowledge that someone else had seen. I forced myself to meet his gaze, though every part of me wanted to shrink away. "You can't scare me anymore," I whispered. My voice trembled, but the words were true. For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He let out a low laugh, cold and humorless, before storming out the door, his boots striking the floor like thunder. The moment he was gone, my knees weakened, and I leaned against the wall to catch my breath. Helen's door remained closed, but I knew she was listening, probably waiting to make sure he didn't come back. A wave of gratitude washed over me, mingled with shame. I hated that my private torment had spilled into the open, that my neighbor had seen the pieces of me Richard had broken. Yet, as I stood there in the silence he left behind, I felt something stir inside me. Not just fear, not just exhaustion, but something else, something like defiance. Richard thought he still held every chain around me, but what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that my heart had once belonged to another. Jonathan Miller, his boss, my first love, the one man who had ever made me feel alive, truly alive, before I buried myself in a marriage that slowly consumed me. And fate, with its cruel, twisting sense of humor, was about to bring him back into my life. If you're still here listening to my story, I want you to stay with me, because what comes next will unravel secrets Richard never imagined and reveal how one reckless decision in my youth would ignite the fire that could finally set me free or destroy me. Don't go anywhere. Share this moment, hold on to it, because my story is only just beginning. The autumn evening carried a crispness that made every light in the city glow sharper, every sound ring clearer. I hadn't planned on attending the charity gala. Crowds unsettled me these days, and the thought of being seen as the newly divorced woman, standing alone, twisted something inside me. But Linda Hayes, my dearest friend, insisted. "You need to breathe again, Evelyn. Come with me. Just once," she had said. So I went, slipping into a black dress that had been pushed to the back of my closet, a relic of another life. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, music floated above the murmur of voices, and for a moment I felt like a stranger in my own skin. And then I saw him. Jonathan Miller. The years had not dulled him. If anything, they had carved a deeper strength into his features. His hair, once dark, had softened into silver, but his eyes, those steady, piercing eyes, remained unchanged. He stood near the stage, speaking with a group of donors, his posture confident yet unassuming. The sight of him unraveled decades in an instant. My breath caught. For a moment I was 19 again, barefoot in summer grass, listening to the sound of his laughter as the world stretched wide before us. I thought I had buried that part of me, but seeing him made it pulse back to life. Linda followed my gaze and whispered, "Do you know him?" I could only nod, my throat tightening. As if fate had heard my silent turmoil, Jonathan turned. His eyes swept across the room, lingering only briefly on faces until they landed on mine. Recognition flashed, and his expression softened into something I had never seen from him before. Relief. He excused himself and crossed the room without hesitation, every step purposeful, as if he had been waiting for this moment too. "Evelyn," he said when he reached me, his voice low, warm, and achingly familiar. "After all these years." I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Finally, I managed, "Jonathan, I didn't think I'd ever." "Neither did I." He smiled, though it carried a trace of sorrow. "You look the same. Stronger, maybe." We spoke in fragments at first, cautious and trembling, like two people learning how to walk again. He asked about my life, my daughter, and I answered carefully, avoiding the darkest truths. I asked about his work, and he told me of the company he had built, the one that had grown far beyond the youthful ambitions I once admired. He spoke of travels, of losses, of victories, but beneath it all was a current that hadn't faded. When the conversation slowed, he lowered his voice. "I regret letting you go, Evelyn. I regret it every day." The words pierced through me. For years, I had carried my own regrets in silence, believing I was the only one haunted by what we lost. To hear them echoed back was both a balm and a wound. But reality is never gentle. Across the ballroom, a flash of movement caught my attention. Richard. He wasn't invited, yet there he was, standing near the entrance, his eyes locked on us with a fury that turned my blood cold. His lips curled into a cruel smile as if he had stumbled upon a secret worth destroying. Jonathan followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. "Is that?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice shaking. "That's Richard." For a moment, neither of us moved. The music carried on, laughter swirled around us, but all I could feel was the heat of Richard's stare burning through me. He didn't approach, not yet. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to remind me that I was not free. Not really. Jonathan touched my arm gently, grounding me. "He can't hurt you here," he said. "Not now." But the truth was written in Richard's eyes, even from across the room. He would not let this pass. He had always been a man who thrived on control, and seeing me with Jonathan, his boss no less, was an insult he would never forgive. That night, when I finally returned home, the echo of Jonathan's voice lingered in my mind, mingling with the shadow of Richard's glare. The two men represented everything my life had been, what I had lost, and what still threatened me. I knew then that Richard's rage was not finished. It was only beginning. It started with the feeling of being watched, a shadow that seemed to linger just beyond the street lamp, the weight of eyes on me as I walked home from the market, the faint trace of cigarette smoke curling through the night air when no one should have been there. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of nerves left behind by years of Richard's temper. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. He was there, always there. One evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No stamp, no name, just my own address scrawled across the front in jagged letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words printed in black ink that made my stomach turn cold. "You will never belong to anyone else." The letters were uneven, smudged as if written with a shaking hand. I dropped the paper, my knees threatening to give way. Every part of me wanted to pretend it wasn't real, to burn it and forget. But I couldn't. It was proof that Richard had taken his threats further, moving from words to actions, from anger to obsession. That night, I called Linda. She came over without hesitation, her presence filling my small apartment with warmth I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. She picked up the letter with trembling fingers, her face tightening with fury. "You need to go to the police, Evelyn," she urged. "This isn't something you can ignore. He's escalating." "I know," I whispered, sinking into the couch. "But the police, they'll ask for evidence. They'll say it's just a note. They'll say nothing happened yet." Linda sat beside me, gripping my hand. "Don't wait until something does happen. He's dangerous. He's always been dangerous. Her words echoed in me, clashing against the stubborn part of myself that had survived decades by enduring in silence. But silence had nearly destroyed me once. I couldn't let it happen again. Still, even as I considered her advice, my mind wandered to Jonathan. Seeing him again had awakened something I thought I had buried forever. He had looked at me as though I was still the girl he once loved, not just the broken woman Richard had tried to shape me into. And for the first time in years, I felt like my heart still had a pulse. But Richard knew. I could see it in the way his eyes followed me at the gala, the twisted satisfaction in his smile. He knew Jonathan was back in my life, and that knowledge would drive him further than he had ever gone. One night, I woke to the sound of floorboards creaking, my breath caught, every muscle stiffening. I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, I saw him. Richard was standing at the foot of my bed. The shadows cloaked him, but his presence was undeniable. The smell of whiskey, the outline of his shoulders, the way his breath rattled in the silence. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would wake the entire building. "You thought you could escape me," he murmured, his voice low and chilling. "But you're mine. You'll always be mine." I wanted to scream, to lunge for the phone, but fear pinned me in place. Then as quickly as he had come, he turned and slipped out of the room, leaving only the echo of his words behind. The front door clicked shut a moment later, and I was left trembling in the dark, my chest heaving as if I had just outrun a storm. The next morning, I told Linda. Her face paled, and she grabbed my shoulders. "Evelyn, you can't wait any longer. If you don't protect yourself now, there might not be a later." Her urgency was real, but so was my hesitation. Going to the police meant admitting that my fear had become my reality, that Richard was no longer just an echo of my past, but a predator haunting my present. Yet in the midst of all the terror, a spark of defiance flared. Richard wanted me to crumble, to retreat into silence and submission, but I couldn't. Not this time. Not when Jonathan had returned. Not when life was offering me even the faintest chance at something more than survival. What I didn't realize then was how far Richard was willing to go, how deep his need for control ran. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The storm had only begun to gather, and the next strike would tear through everything I thought I could endure. If you're listening now, don't turn away. Stay with me. Share this story, because what comes next will break your heart, ignite your anger, and prove just how far a desperate man will go when he believes he has nothing left to lose. The morning after Richard invaded my home, the air in my apartment felt poisoned. Every creak of the floor, every shift of the curtains made me jump. I kept replaying the moment he stood at the foot of my bed, his words wrapping around me like chains. "You'll always be mine." I forced myself to go through the motions, coffee, dishes, answering emails, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The world outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Yet inside me, everything had cracked. Jonathan called that afternoon. His voice was steady, warm, grounding. "Evelyn, you don't sound okay. What's wrong?" For a moment, I almost lied. Old habits are hard to kill, habits born from years of minimizing, pretending, hiding the truth. But Jonathan had seen me at my lowest before. He had loved me even when I was too broken to love myself. The lie died on my lips. "He was here," I whispered. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "Richard came into my apartment last night." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that holds back fury. Then Jonathan's voice cut through, sharp with determination. "I'm coming over. You are not staying there alone." I wanted to protest, to tell him I could manage, but deep down, I didn't want to be alone. Not anymore. When he arrived, he brought the same presence he always had, a quiet strength that filled the space and made me breathe easier. He didn't bombard me with questions or promises. Instead, he simply held me, letting the storm inside me break. Late editor Linda joined us. She set her bag on the counter, looked at both of us, and spoke with the authority of someone who had run out of patience for fear. "This is no longer about surviving day to day. This is about stopping him. If we don't act now, he'll push further. He already has." Jonathan nodded in agreement. "We go to the police. Tonight." The word police made my stomach knot. I thought of the years I had spent silenced by Richard's threats, The times I had convinced myself that no one would believe me. But Jonathan's hand found mine, grounding me. Linda's eyes blazed with certainty. For the first time, I wasn't facing this alone. That evening, we sat in a sterile office under flickering fluorescent lights. I gave my statement, my voice breaking but unrelenting. I told them about the threats, the letter, the invasion into my home. The officer wrote everything down, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. Without physical evidence or a direct act of violence, there's only so much we can do, he said flatly. The words hit me like ice water. Linda slammed her hand on the desk. So a woman has to be bleeding before you'll protect her? The officer shifted uncomfortably but didn't retract his words. Jonathan squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt, as if to remind me that despite the system's indifference, I wasn't alone. We left the station with little more than a report number and the hollow promise that they'd keep an eye out. That night, fear gave way to something new, anger. I sat in my apartment staring at the lock Richard had bypassed so easily, and I felt the rage I had buried for years rise like fire in my chest. He wanted me afraid, silent, cornered. But the Evelyn he knew no longer existed. Jonathan stayed with me, sleeping on the couch. At dawn, I walked into the living room and found him awake, sitting with his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes carried both exhaustion and a fierce resolve. "I'm not going to let him destroy you again," he said quietly. Tears stung my eyes, but they weren't just from fear anymore. They were from hope, fragile yet undeniable. Richard had built his life around control, but the grip he once had on me was slipping. With every step I took toward reclaiming myself, his power weakened. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. The storm was circling closer, and Richard wasn't a man who gave up. He would come again. And the next time, it wouldn't be just a note or a shadow in the night. If you've followed me this far, don't look away. Share this story. The worst is still ahead, and when it comes, you'll see the true face of obsession and the strength it takes to finally break free. The days after reporting Richard blurred into a haze of tension. Every step outside my apartment felt like walking through a minefield. My eyes darted over shoulders, scanning crowds, certain he was lurking nearby. The locks on my door were changed, yet I still jolted awake at every sound, expecting him to be standing in the shadows again. Jonathan remained close, his presence steady as stone. He moved between tenderness and vigilance with seamless ease, making me tea in the morning, then checking the hallway like a guard before bed. Linda called daily, her voice sharp and determined, never letting me sink back into the silence Richard once demanded of me. But Richard wasn't retreating. He was circling. One evening, as I returned from work, I found a wilted bouquet of roses propped against my door. No card, no signature, just the scent of decay. My breath froze. I didn't need proof to know whose hands had placed them there. Jonathan arrived minutes later. His jaw tightened as he stared at the dead flowers. He didn't say a word, just picked them up, carried them to the dumpster, and washed his hands as if ridding himself of poison. That night, his temper cracked. "This has to end, Evelyn. He's escalating. First letters, then your apartment, now this. It's only going to get worse." His voice was rough with fury, not at me but at the situation that kept dragging us into darkness. I touched his arm. "Do you think the police will finally take this seriously?" Jonathan shook his head, his expression dark. "Not until he leaves a bruise, and I'm not letting it get that far." 2 days later, Richard proved him right. I was leaving the grocery store, a bag of fruit in my arms, when he appeared. No warning, no crowd thick enough to shield me. Just Richard, leaning casually against a car as if he had every right to be there. His eyes locked on me, and the smirk I knew too well spread across his face. "Did you enjoy the flowers?" he asked, his tone low, mocking, laced with menace. The bag slipped from my hands, apples scattering across the pavement. My heart thundered in my chest, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Stay away from me, Richard. I mean it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for no one else to hear. "You think Jonathan can protect you? He won't always be there. And when he isn't, you'll remember who really owns you." For the first time, I didn't flinch. Something inside me hardened, a steel I had never recognized before. "You don't own me. Not anymore. His smirk faltered. The mask of control he wore so easily cracked, and in its place flashed the raw, ugly rage of a man losing his grip. His hand twitched as if he might reach for me, but before he could, Jonathan's voice cut through the air. "Step away from her." I turned. Jonathan stood only a few yards away, his shoulders squared, his voice steady with a warning that left no room for interpretation. Richard's eyes flicked between us, calculating, weighing his options. Then, with a snarl, he backed off, retreating into the crowd. Jonathan's hands were shaking when he reached me, though his arms were strong as they wrapped around me. "He's slipping," he said, his breath hot against my hair. "That's when he's most dangerous." Later that night, Linda stormed into my apartment after hearing what happened. "We don't wait for the police anymore," she declared. "If they won't protect you, then we find another way. Restraining order, security cameras, a lawyer, whatever it takes." The fear inside me no longer felt like a prison. It was fuel. Richard wanted me small, wanted me silent. But his obsession had awakened something fierce in me, a determination that this cycle would end, even if I had to drag the truth into the light myself. The mask he had worn for so long, the charming husband, the man who claimed to love me, was gone. What stood in its place was a predator stripped of pretense. And predators, when cornered, become the most dangerous of all. Sleep became a fragile thing, shattered by the smallest sound. Every night I double-checked the locks, pressed my ear to the door, and told myself the silence meant safety. But silence had betrayed me before. Richard was unraveling, and we all knew it. The wilted roses, the ambush at the grocery store, those were no longer warnings. They were preludes. Jonathan carried himself like a man constantly braced for impact. Even when he tried to ease the tension with humor or a soft smile, I could see the storm brewing in him, his protective instincts stretching thin against the pressure. Linda's resolve only sharpened. She arrived one evening with folders stacked high. "Documentation," she said firmly. "Every call, every sighting, every word he's thrown at you. We'll bury him in proof if we have to." But Richard wasn't waiting for paper battles. He wanted fear, and he wanted it raw. It was late, the sky thick with rain, when I heard it, knuckles pounding against my door. My heart froze. Jonathan wasn't there. He had gone out briefly to pick up dinner. I stood motionless, clutching the edge of the couch, praying it was a neighbor. Then came his voice. "Flynn, open the door. Don't make me knock again." The venom behind my name made my knees buckle. He sounded calm, but it was the kind of calm that came before breaking bones. I backed away, fumbling for my phone, dialing Jonathan with trembling hands. He answered on the first ring. "He's here," I whispered, barely able to breathe. "Don't open the door. I'm 2 minutes away," Jonathan said, his tone clipped with urgency. Richard's voice grew harsher. "You think you can ignore me? You think Jonathan makes you safe? I told you if you dared to see someone else, you'd see who I really am." His fist struck the door again, rattling the frame. My fear turned to fire. I grabbed the recorder Linda had insisted I keep. My hands shook as I hit the button, but I held it steady toward the door. His words, his rage, every syllable would be captured now. Proof he could never twist. The pounding stopped, replaced by a silence more dangerous than the noise. Then came a slow scrape, metal against metal. He was trying to force the lock. My pulse roared in my ears as I backed into the kitchen, clutching a knife, though I knew it would never be enough against him. The hallway erupted in shouts. Jonathan's voice cut through the air like a blade, followed by the heavy thud of bodies colliding. I dropped the knife and ran toward the sound. By the time I flung the door open, Jonathan had Richard pinned against the wall, rain streaming down both their faces. Richard's eyes blazed with hatred, but Jonathan's fury was steadier, anchored by something Richard had never known. Love, not control. "Get away from her, or I swear I'll end this tonight," Jonathan growled. Neighbors began peeking out of their doors, their murmurs swelling into a crowd. Richard's mask slipped again. His arrogance crumbled beneath the weight of witnesses. He spat on the ground, yanked himself free, and hurled one last threat. "This isn't over, Evelyn. You can't erase me." Police sirens wailed in the distance, drawn by calls from frightened neighbors. Richard bolted down the stairwell, vanishing into the storm before the flashing lights arrived. I stood shaking in the doorway, Jonathan's arms wrapping around me, holding me together when I was sure I'd shatter. "You're safe now," he whispered, though his eyes told me he didn't believe it fully. Linda rushed over minutes later, soaked from the rain but burning with purpose. She pressed the recorder into the officer's hands, her voice steady. "You wanted evidence? Here it is. You have no excuse now." For the first time, I felt something shift, not just fear, but power. The terror Richard tried to chain me with was no longer mine to carry alone. Jonathan's strength, Linda's unyielding fight, and my own refusal to break were no longer scattered, they were a shield. Richard had seen me as weak, as his possession. But standing there, trembling yet unbroken, I realized something undeniable. He was the one unraveling, and I was the one rising. The storm outside raged on, lightning splitting the sky, but inside I felt the first flicker of clarity. Richard's war wasn't just against me anymore, it was against truth itself. And truth, once spoken, could not be silenced. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the streets washed clean yet heavy with the memory of last night's chaos. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands curled around a mug I hadn't touched, watching the steam fade into the air. Jonathan moved quietly around me, not pressing, just present, his steady presence grounding me more than words ever could. Linda arrived with her usual determined stride, her hair still damp from the drizzle outside, and spread papers across the table. "We're not waiting anymore," she declared. "I've filed for an emergency protective order. The recording, the witnesses, the police report, it's enough to corner him." I wanted to believe her, to let her confidence sink into my skin, but fear lingered, whispering that Richard was still out there, watching, plotting. His threats clung to me like smoke, impossible to wash away. That evening I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My face was pale, yes, but my eyes held something I hadn't noticed before, an edge of defiance. I realized that Richard's grip on me wasn't physical anymore. It was the echo of his voice, the poison he'd planted in my mind, and I was done letting it root. The call came 2 nights later. A neighbor reported seeing Richard lurking near the building. Within minutes, officers swarmed the block. This time, he didn't slip away. They found him crouched behind a parked car, a knife in his hand, his eyes wild and unhinged. I stood at the window as they dragged him into the flashing red and blue, his gaze locked on mine, hatred spilling from him like venom. But for the first time, I didn't look away. I held his stare, unblinking, until the car door slammed and he disappeared behind steel and glass. Relief didn't come in a rush. It seeped slowly, like sunlight after a long storm. For days, I jumped at shadows, expecting him to reappear. But each morning that passed without his presence felt like a step toward freedom. Jonathan never left my side. He didn't smother me with promises he couldn't control. Instead, he offered small acts, fixing the broken lock, cooking dinner when my hands shook too much, holding me through the nightmares. Love, I learned, wasn't loud. It was steady. It was patient. Linda pressed forward with legal fire, ensuring Richard's arrest spiraled into charges he couldn't wriggle out of. "He built his life on intimidation," she said one night, exhaustion lining her voice. "But intimidation only works until someone refuses to bow." I thought of that often. Refusal. Resistance. My story hadn't been about running. It had been about standing, about reclaiming the pieces he tried to scatter. Weeks later, I returned to the park where Jonathan and I first sat together, the place where fear had softened enough for me to let him in. The air was crisp, leaves rustling overhead, and for the first time in years, I felt my chest expand without the weight of dread pressing down. "I keep waiting to feel like myself again," I admitted softly. Jonathan brushed his fingers against mine. "Maybe you don't have to go back. Maybe you're someone stronger now." His words settled inside me, not as comfort, but as truth. The woman who once trembled under Richard's shadow was gone. I wasn't returning to her. I was building someone new, someone who had walked through fire and emerged scarred, but unburned. Later that evening, I lit a single candle by the window, not for Richard, not for what was lost, but for myself, for survival, for the courage that had carried me here. even when I thought it had abandoned me. Richard had wanted me to see who he really was, and I had. But in his unraveling, I had also seen who I really was, resilient, unyielding, and free. The war was over, not because he surrendered, but because I no longer played his game. The silence in my apartment was no longer suffocating. It was peace, it was mine.